Namaskar and welcome to our weekly program on key stories related to the economy from an Indian perspective. On the program, a State Bank of India report suggests that new labour reforms will generate around 77 lakh new jobs. America's $37 trillion debt and rivalry with China meets reluctant dependence. India takes flight. Safran's Hyderabad engine hub marks a major push up the global aviation value chain. Cuba unveils sweeping reforms to invite foreign investment amid economic strain. Let's get a deeper understanding of the labour reforms from Rajiv Gauba. And he's member Niti Aayog currently and former Cabinet Secretary to the Government of India. But the reforms are a consolidation of 29 laws into 4 labour codes. A code on wages, industrial relations code, the code on social security and occupational safety, health and working conditions code. Now here he looks at things from an employer's point of view.
From the perspective of the employers, they have the facility now to engage fixed-term workers without any restriction on sectors or the number of employees. So that will be a huge incentive for them to create more employment opportunities. And the second incentive for the employers, for the investors, is that there is a paradigm shift in terms of ease of doing business. Because we earlier had a large number of licenses to be taken. I think there were 4 different licenses, 8 registrations, and 31 returns to be filed. So in place of all of this now, you will have single license, single registration, and 1 return.
So let's look at the impact of India's new labour reforms, and we are basing this analysis largely on the SBI report. And they're looking at medium-term outlook for employment as well as formalization of the economy. That's the broad sweep. Moving on to our next slide. So what has happened is that 29 labour laws have been consolidated into 4 codes, and it's a simplified compliance and also has given stronger worker protections. Let's look at some of the key areas. Wages, for instance, in wages now, there's a uniform definition. There's the basic DA and there's retaining allowance. Then there is social security. In social security, we are looking at an expanded, it's expanded the network to gig workers, platform workers, unorganized sector workers, and then safety. And in safety, in fact, the premises audit needs to be done, and safety measures for women who are now allowed to work in the night. So all that has to be put in place. And then as far as, I beg your pardon, industrial relations is concerned, there are simplified rules as well for trade unions and dispute resolution. Moving on to our next slide. So this report says that there's an estimated 77 lakh new jobs that are likely to be created. Let's look at, they're also talking about labour force participation of 60%. That basically means that 6 out of 10 people or, in the working age population are actually employed. So the labour force participation is actually calculated by the labour force divided by the working age population into 100. So you're getting 60.1%, which means about 6 out of 10 people in that age group are actually working. It's also projected unemployment reduction to about 1.3%. So that good indicators as a result of the labour laws. Now move on to our next story, our next slide. Formalization is an important aspect. It's formalizing the workforce, rising now to about 64 to 85%. What is this happening? This is through greater formalization within 2 to 3 years. We are seeing this because, after all, the gig workers, have now got, there's a clearer definition as to what is wages and things like that. So all that makes things more or less formalized. And everything is rather streamlined for the employer as well. There's also stronger workplace protections, as I was talking about earlier, and lower adjustment costs for businesses. Adjustment costs over the long term are likely to come down. Adjustment cost is basically when a company needs to spend less because of compliances. After all, now things are much easier, hence you will be spending less. But in the short term, they may actually have to spend a little more. We'll come to that a little later. Moving on to our next slide. So the coverage, in fact, of Social Security expansion, coverage is increasing to about 64% to 85% within 2 to 3 years. Insurance benefits, pensions, insurance benefits, all this is enhanced safety net. We are talking about that too. We are moving also to consumption boost, perhaps. Our next slide is about consumption boost. Yeah, indeed. Consumption boost. Savings rate is increased as a result of this to about 30%, and that's going to support demand. And there's going to be a projected release of about 75,000 crores into the consumption cycle. That demand is going to, push a lot of sectors forward, and that's equivalent to about 66 rupees per person per day added into the spending kitty. So that will have broader implications, because this is going to have some in the beginning, it might have some inflation consequences, but they are likely to increase the demand, and hence it's going to help the economy to grow. Moving on to our next slide. So we're going to see higher productivity and resilient labor markets. This is the broader implications. We can understand that. That is because, after all, there is more formalization in the economy and more people are working. And as a result of that, there's going to be higher productivity, resilient labor markets, stronger demand, as I was talking about, which is driving multi-sector growth. And there's going to be better alignments with global labor standards. So hence, it's going to help us bring in more investments. And our final slide, let's move on to something called challenges and perhaps the way forward. We can see that I was going to tell you about the short-term compliance costs are likely to go up, because in the short term, the companies are likely to spend more, to try and get into the whole scheme of things, because you're moving away from one system and starting another. So adjustment, initially, there's going to be, an updating records, also registers, filings. All these things will begin, maybe you'll have legal expenses. All this would initially cost more, but then there's the importance of a smooth transition and awareness efforts that are necessary. Awareness is important, and workers need to know their rights. That is part of the whole idea of these reforms. And then in the medium term, gains will outweigh initial frictions. So before we introduce our guest on the program, let's once again listen to Rajiv Gauba, and he's explaining things from the employee's point of view now.
One, that there is a mandatory appointment letter, which means that every worker will have a written proof of his being on the rolls. So it gives a sense of security. Second, minimum wage. The minimum wage was earlier applicable only to scheduled industries. So large sections of workers were not covered by the minimum wage stipulation. Now all workers will have a statutorily guaranteed minimum wage. Third, these codes introduced for the first time the concept of a floor wage to reduce disparities across states and promote standard of living. Fourth, earlier there was no concept of timely wage payment. So now by law the employers will have to pay wages on time, daily or weekly or monthly. It will be huge relief for the workers. When you do overtime, you get paid at twice the usual or the normal rate.
Well, Dr. Amit Kapoor, Honorary Chairman at the Institute of Competitiveness, eminent economist, is joining us now. Dr. Kapoor, how much of these reforms depend on how, industries respond?
So, Mark, this is an important question. Government can only do so much in terms of like notifying the laws, etc., because the parliament has created this very robust mechanism. Because I think it's a stupendous effort. Because if you're able to reduce the number of sections from 1500 odd to 400 odd, is an exceptional effort in terms of understanding what needs to be done. But from an enterprise point of view, I think it becomes a very important step for improving their competitiveness itself, their productivity itself. Yes, there can be some initial hiccups, but industry will have to come up to speed because the kind of effects this will have on the economy are fairly strong. As you said in the earlier set of remarks itself, like what is going to be the multiplier, what kind of wage increase that can happen, what kind of formalization will happen, that would be there. Yes, the initial hiccup is there in terms of, say, some paperwork that will be required, but overall burden is actually going to be so dramatically reduced because there is also one very important element here which you've not really touched is about the decriminalization that happens here.
Right.
And because there was always this worry what is going to happen or whatever. So you're really taking an important step. But yes, for the enterprises, this also means that they will actually have much better policies towards HR or better HR policies, better what do you call
Right.
taking care of your people itself. But the most important element here, as you see for enterprises, is like what India has seen in the last 3 or 4 years is this rise of gig workers, and the rise of the platform economy. Within that space, it was very important and exceedingly important that what do you call workers are formalized, and that is exactly what is going to happen. So this would also
Okay.
mean that there is an important step happening. So it's just not enterprises; it's a complete overhaul of a structure that India was actually operating on.
But
Yes, when you create a new structure, there are those initial hiccups that will happen, but I really see those hiccups to be very minor blip
okay.
in terms of like how things would really move forward.
But Dr. Kapoor, one can also argue that, should one actually formalize the gig sector or just allow it to evolve because it seems to be developing on its own. The gigs are increasing with regard to online platforms as well, including YouTube and things like that, and people are generally working, when needed. What's the reason to formalize all this?
So, I think your question in itself is giving an answer here itself. Because when you talk about gig workers, there are two categories of gig workers that we are talking about here. Like one is, of course, when you talk about people who work for enterprises like, say, Zomato or Blinkit, etc. Because these are people who are talking about delivery or a payment for every delivery that they actually make. So they were not in this scene in terms of saying that they were formalized or whatever. They were really seen as what you would call as what you call small entrepreneurs, or you might whatever you want to use the
Yeah.
term as. But it becomes important that formalization happens there. But when you talk about YouTube, etc., or Instagram, or whatever be the platforms, these are creative people. Creative people do not need that level of formalization because they are educated people, they are talented people. I'm not saying others are not talented, but what I'm saying here is there is a very interesting skill aspect as well. So when you talk about high level of skills or higher order of skills, that is where you're talking about YouTube, etc. And look at the kind of people who are operating there. They do not need that mechanism of formalization. But when you talk about gig workers in terms of, say, people who are delivering and other those
Right.
sets or urban clap, etc., they need that formalization. It becomes very important, and I think it's a right step.
Okay.
It was long time coming. There can be some kind of resentment or whatever, but it is important that these people are treated as employees itself because we need to protect the interests of people. It just cannot be that only enterprises are taking the benefits of that, because you need to make sure that people who are there, who are working, they need to be protected, their interests needs to be protected. And India is not the first country who has done it. If you really
Okay.
look at California also went through this whole cycle.
Sure. Do stay with us, Dr. Kapoor. We are moving on to our next story, and this is about America's debt story. It's full of contradictions. Washington warns the world about China's influence, yet leans on Beijing as other foreign creditors to fund its own record borrowing. With nearly $37 trillion in debt, the paradox of dependence and rivalry defines today's global financial stage. Let's look at this report. America's debt story is full of paradoxes. On one hand, Washington warns the world about China's growing influence. On the other, it quietly relies on Beijing to help finance its own spending. Let's break it down. The United States carries a staggering debt load of nearly $37 trillion. Of that, foreign governments hold about $6 trillion. And while China is often portrayed as America's biggest lender, the reality is more nuanced. China holds about $750 billion in US treasuries, roughly 2% of the total. That's significant, but not the largest. Japan tops the list with more than $1 trillion, and the United Kingdom holds slightly more than China. Japan keenly supports the idea of debt sustainability.
The theme set by South Africa is aligning with Japan's priority, such as disaster risk reduction, energy transition, debt sustainability, and critical minerals. So Japan is committed to contributing further, building on our long-standing efforts.
China buys US debt for trade and stability. Export dollars go into treasuries, safe, strategic, and useful for managing currency, keeping exports competitive and securing assets. Here's the paradox. America warns allies of Chinese debt traps, yet relies on Beijing's capital. The gap shows global finance realities. Treasuries anchor the world economy, irresistible even to rivals. The real issue is America's debt. At over 100% of GDP, borrowing is historic, tying foreign holders from Tokyo to London to Beijing into the US equation. Trump argues tariffs shift the dynamic.
It's a lot of money, but we've taken in a lot of money from tariffs. The tariffs allow us to give a dividend if we want to do that. Now we're going to do a dividend, and we're also going to be reducing debt. We have, because of Biden and others, we have a 37 trillion in debt. So we're going to be doing a dividend, which people will enjoy and spend and do what they want. But we're also going to be reducing debt very substantially.
This debt dynamic unfolds amid the US trade war, with tariffs, tech limits, and supply chain shifts reshaping commerce. America's reliance on Chinese capital is paradoxical, funding deficits through its rival. The outcome, a fragile balance of interdependence and rivalry. The Economic Brief, DD India.
Well, Dr. Kapoor continues to be with us. Dr. Kapoor, well, the US debt is unlikely to be paid back ever. So, I mean, why is this not a problem for countries that hold the US treasuries?
So, first we need to understand the very nature of debt that we are really talking about. Like, one is, of course, there are those treasuries in which the Chinese government has invested, and there is a large sum that has actually happened, and that does help China in terms of maintaining their exchange rates, etc. But there's a larger thing here, because US is identified as the single largest recipient of official sector credit from China, say, which is close to about $200 billion between 2000 to 2023. Yes, US government does warn people of predatory lending, etc. But who are the kind of entities who are borrowing in the US? The developing countries and say somebody like US, there is a very big difference. And the difference is the nature of debt. The nature of debt, when you really talk about the nature of debt here, it's a non-sovereign debt that is actually happening. Because unlike the sovereign debt seen in developing nations, what happens is that it is guaranteed by there is a public guarantee that happens there. So if you really look at Africa, the public guarantee is there. So, but in this case, within the US, most of the time when the debt is being taken, it is being taken by enterprises. Right. So if you really look at the kind of debt that is being given, 56% of corporate liquidity, right, or so the debt that is happening there, say Fortune 500 companies that are really taking it for, say, working capital. 22% of the financing for mergers and acquisition is happening through Chinese money, but it is not publicly guaranteed. It's the enterprises. So this is also risk debt, not that the Chinese are not really doing it. But I think there's a strategic point that we need to really understand, and that is that Beijing, or when you call Beijing, it is more like China. China is looking at it as a lending through a strategic lens for a simple reason: it gives access to technology and maintaining its market position. So there's a very interesting thing that is happening here. So we should really define the Chinese debt to the US from a very different point of view.
So there is a trade war currently on between the two, US and China. And what happens, I mean, if China starts using this as a weapon, instead starts reducing its debt holdings rather sharply? What's going to happen to what's likely to happen?
I think the US reaction speaks for itself. Like how US has really reacted to Chinese is very, very limited. Like they have been more ballistic on India than the Chinese, because for a simple reason, they understand that if Chinese money is withdrawn from the enterprises that are operating in the US, it is going to create a crisis of sorts. For a simple reason that the US working capital really gets sucked out. If I suck out money from the top 500 companies, the companies will not be able to operate. Where will that money come from? The US banking system is not having that kind of money to really trade or give to the enterprises. Even if they have that money, then suddenly you're talking about high levels of interest charges on it. So you are really going to face that issue. So China is on a very different stage in terms of like how trade war is happening. I think US is following a much more adverse bullying tactic with other countries like say Brazil, etc., rather than China, because China controls a lot of enterprises, and we need to accept that.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Dr. Amit Kapoor. Thank you very much for joining us and helping us unpack these stories. Now, moving on to our next story, India is pushing hard to rise in global aviation as well. As airlines expand rapidly, the government is driving high-value capabilities at home. Safran's new engine MRO in Hyderabad marks a shift towards advanced manufacturing, skilled jobs and investment-led growth, potentially reshaping India's aerospace role. Diptanshu Kashyap reports.
India is stepping up as a global player in aircraft maintenance and repair. Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurated Safran Aircraft Engine Services India, or SAESI, in Hyderabad. Spread over 45,000 square meters with an investment of Rs 1,300 crore, the facility will employ over 1,000 skilled technicians and is expected to service up to 300 aircraft engines annually, strengthening India's position in the aviation value chain.
हमारा 85% एमआरओ का काम देश के बाहर होता रहा है। इससे खर्च बढ़ता था, समय ज़्यादा लगता था और एयरक्राफ्ट लंबे समय तक ग्राउंडेड रहते थे। ये स्थिति भारत जैसे विशाल एविएशन मार्केट के लिए ठीक नहीं थी। इसलिए आज भारत सरकार देश के दुनिया के एक बड़े एमआरओ केंद्र के रूप में विकसित कर रही है। अब पहली बार देश में एक ग्लोबल ओईएम डीप लेवल सर्विसिंग की सुविधा स्थापित कर रहा है। साथियों, साफरान की ग्लोबल ट्रेनिंग, नॉलेज ट्रांसफर और भारत के इंस्टीट्यूशंस के साथ साझेदारी, इससे देश में एक ऐसी वर्कफोर्स तैयार होगी जो आने वाले वर्षों में पूरे एमआरओ इकोसिस्टम को नई गति, नई दिशा देगी।
The new facility addresses a major financial inefficiency in the sector. Most maintenance works were previously outsourced overseas, increasing costs and keeping aircraft grounded longer. SAESI is expected to retain this economic activity within India, improving operational efficiency for airlines and generating high-value employment in the aerospace supply chain.
I would also add that I am very attached to Make in India, as I was born in India, so I was made in India also. That attests to the validity of your model. Prime Minister, esteemed partners, Chief Minister, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your unwavering and constant support, and we look forward to continuing our support to India and to grow together with your country.
Beyond maintenance, the facility could catalyze further economic activity. By encouraging Safran to explore engine and component design in India, the government is positioning the country to capture higher value segments of the aerospace industry, leveraging its young talent pool and MSME network. Analysts say such investments could boost India's export potential and global competitiveness in the sector.
For India, SAESI is more than just a repairing facility. It's an economic milestone, enhancing domestic capabilities, creating skilled employment, and capturing high-value work that previously went abroad. The facility is a test case for how strategic investments can strengthen India's role as a global aviation hub and stimulate broader industrial growth. In New Delhi with camera person Manoj, this is Diptanshu Kashyap for the Economic Brief, DD India.
And Cuba is enacting major economic reforms to revive an economy hit by shortages, blackouts and currency wars. At the Havana International Fair, officials announced steps to ease foreign investment rules and speed approvals, a shift that could reshape how the island draws capital under mounting financial strain. We leave you with Diptanshu Kashyap's explanation. Thanks for watching the Economic Brief.
See you again next week. Namaskar.
Cuba is signaling one of its most significant economic shifts in years. With the island trapped in a severe foreign currency crisis and facing shortages of food, medicine and fuel, the government is using the Havana International Fair to unveil a new package of measures designed to energize foreign investment. Officials say the goal is to expand the operational freedom of foreign companies and streamline a system long criticized for heavy bureaucracy and slow approvals.
Se va a establecer un nuevo esquema diferenciado.
We have initiated, as part of the government's program of actions, a process of partial dollarization of the economy, and foreign investment operates mainly in national currency. However, as part of this process of partial dollarization, it has been identified as desirable for them to be able to operate in both currencies flexibly so that, according to their needs, they can generate operations in different sectors of the economy.
De este proceso de dolarización parcial.
The reforms mark a clear departure from Cuba's traditionally rigid Soviet-style investment model. Foreign firms would be allowed to operate and pay employees in US dollars, hire workers directly, manage bank accounts abroad, and import their own fuel when supplies run short. Procedures that once took weeks are being cut down to days, and Havana says it wants foreign capital to play a greater role in its banking and financial sector, a space historically shielded from outside influence. At this year's fair, which brought together 715 companies from 52 countries, the government showcased new thematic investment zones and partnerships aimed at sectors it sees as critical to economic transformation. But the broader context remains challenging. A plunging peso, record migration, and tightened US sanctions continue to weigh on investor sentiment. Cuba says it approved 32 new business projects worth $2.1 billion this year. Yet experts warn the island needs far more, at least $5 billion annually, to turn its economy around.
For Cuba, foreign investments are now a central part of its economic strategy. But the real test is whether these new rules can attract the scale of capital the island needs. With the economy under strain, the impact of these reforms will decide how quickly Cuba can steady its footing. In New Delhi with camera person Manoj, this is Diptanshu Kashyap for the Economic Brief, DD India.